olive oil is edible immediately, right? That's what virgin olive oil is. It's unrefined. It's the crude oil. It was just gently pressed, and the oil just, it's so oily, and the olive oil chemical compounds, the fatty acids are stable so that they don't oxidize once they're exposed to the air. But that's not true with the seed oils. Not only do they need all this heat and pressure, and then this refining, the refining strips away the antioxidants that protected the fragile fatty acids, which are called polyunsaturated fatty acids, exposes them to oxygen, and then those will oxidize. And that oxidation takes place forever. Like, it takes place starting in the factory, so that when you buy a bottle of canola oil, it's already got some oxidized fatty acids in there. And then the oxidation just keeps continuing. When the light hits these polyunsaturates, they will oxidize. And when you cook with it, the polyunsaturates will oxidize some more. So the bottles start with a small amount of toxicity, somewhere between 0.6 and 5.2%. So it's it's a lot. It's not parts per billion here, like other toxins in our food supply. Glyphosate, that's parts per billion or parts per trillion, even in some foods. This is parts per hundred. So it's a million times more significant. And then it just gets worse because there's oxygen everywhere, right? So it's a whole different thing than anything else we've ever consumed. And what you want to look for is oils that just don't need refining. And so you want to look for a virgin oil, or the term is often unrefined.
Yeah.
There you are.
Okay. Yeah, I love that. So you're describing this stuff. It's disgusting, and you said it's inedible. And originally, these companies were making it so they could use it for like lubricant. We were running out of, whale blubber and lubricant and that kind of thing, from what I understand. How did this end up being something that was inedible, but then made it into our food system?
Yeah, so the first little leap was as a substitute for lard. The first leap was in the hydrogenated form, the trans fat form. So it wasn't as liquid vegetable oil because it couldn't be, they did not, back when this happened, the time was at the end of the 1900s. So back then, they didn't have all this degumming, debleaching, all the technology. They just hadn't had it worked out. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't have a clue. But they did know how to hydrogenate, because that's how they were making soap. That's how they were turning the liquid cottonseed oil into solid, right? That's hydrogenation hardens or solidifies an oil by eliminating some of those fragile double bonds. It stabilizes the double bonds, and it turns many of them into saturated bonds. It turns some of them into trans bonds, trans double bonds. And those trans bonds are, they can impart like a lard-like consistency to the fat. And so they just fiddled with the formula until they got it to be very much like lard. And since hydrogenation stabilizes the polyunsaturates, it's actually better than oxidized polyunsaturates because it prevents them from oxidizing into toxins. So even though trans fat has its own toxicity, it doesn't magnify the way the polyunsaturated fatty acid toxins do. So it's way less toxic to eat margarine or Crisco than it is to eat food cooked in highly polyunsaturated vegetable oils, especially when we're talking about like restaurant fryers and stuff where they heat it for days on end.
Yeah, I just want the audience to let that sink in. Margarine and Crisco are vastly better than the things we're cooking with now. I mean, both you and Nina do such a great job writing about this. She writes about it, exit trans fat, enter something worse in her book, The Big Fat Surprise. And like you're talking about these restaurants that used to cook in beef tallow because it was a stable fat. I just talked to a woman a few days ago who in the 70s, she used to work at McDonald's, and she would go into this where the vat was and turn it on, and would go from a solid to a liquid. You could cook in it repeatedly and it wouldn't easily oxidize or very quickly. The fries tasted amazing. They switched to doing trans, and now we're just cooking everything in just plain old vegetable oil, which is way, way worse. Like you said, it's it's so bizarre to contemplate.
Well, Casey, I don't know if you noticed, if you picked up on this, but the thing that I find the most horrific is that the food industry itself was saying, we don't want to go away from trans fat to liquid vegetable oils. It was the food industry that was warning that the trans fat ban, they weren't ready for it, because if what they would rather do would stick the lard and tallow back in the fryers. That's what they, if it were up to them, the ones that I talked to, that's what they said. They literally said that. I mean, I would agree with that, but I was kind of shocked that it's what they said too, even though it's more expensive, right? That's what they would rather have done. And so when I asked someone why not make that recommendation, he actually said, well, it's not up to us. They don't ask us. They don't ask the food scientists about what food is more stable in this highly unusual, highly oxidizable environment of a restaurant using a deep fryer. They don't ask us, the experts in it. They ask the American Heart Association. And the American Heart Association, of course, is what they've always said, which is saturated fat is bad, blah, 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 eat vegetable oils. Oh, P.S., did we mention why we say that?
Yeah,
No.
very strange. Great segue. You do such a good job writing about the American Heart Association, and you just think of this organization started out as a sleepy little collection of doctors that were responding to a very rare occurrence. Some people started to get heart attacks around the turn of the 20th century. All of a sudden, that was accelerating through the 40s and 50s, and all of a sudden, everybody's having heart attacks. President Eisenhower's out of office for the time that he's out with a heart attack, and all of a sudden, this tiny little organization rises to power. You do such a good job writing about this. Why should we be distrustful about an organization that on the front of it, it says American Heart Association? And like you say in the book, like you would think this is a government agency because of the name, and it's absolutely not. Can you tell us why we need to be suspect of them and their recommendations?
Well, here's why, because in something called conflict of interest, for a medical organization to really be functional in terms of science, which is what medicine is, it's supposed to be a science, they need to be pure of intention. They can't be all about fundraising. And unfortunately, in 1948, there were two groups of people within the American Heart Association with opposite ideas about what their medical association should be doing in order to get at the root cause of heart disease. There was a small group of people who were the purists. They were like, we really can't accept outside funding. It might take longer to get to the answers. It might be harder to spread the word. We might not have the money to do it, but we will have the truth. We're more likely to have the truth. We're more likely to discover the real truth. Whereas the other group was like, wow, don't bother with that. We need to solve this now. People are dying left and right. We don't have the luxury of time. Those are the kinds of arguments I imagine that they were making. It was a very vociferous, the minutes of the meeting were described as very heated. And yeah, so who won? Well, the money, money always talks, right? That's just unfortunately how it is in the capitalist culture that all of us live in. So they voted to accept funding from wherever. But of course, the small group, the purists, they said, well, the people that are going to be giving us money are going to be these giant industries, the captains of industry. And that might influence what we say about the cause of heart disease. That was recorded in the minutes. And that's exactly what ended up happening, because who was the first industry to volunteer to give the American Heart Association a whole bunch of money? Well, golly gee, it was Procter and Gamble, and they needed to sell more soy oil and cottonseed oil. And so things being as they were, the American Heart Association, just all of their research somehow, and I go into exactly how, of course, naturally would end up being positive for their benefactors, exactly as anyone who understands human nature would have predicted.